The first trick I want to teach you is how to use the VS Code CLI. When you install VS Code, it will also give you access to the code command from the terminal. Although if you're on Mac OS, you'll also need to go to the command palette and find the option to install the code command in your path. You can validate the installation by running code flag v to print out the current VS Code version. If you want more information than that, you can run code flag status to print out process usage and additional diagnostics. But the most useful part of the CLI is simply opening up files and folders with VS Code. If you're in the terminal and want to open up the current working directory, simply type in code period, and that opens the directory up in VS Code. Or instead of a period, you can type in the relative path to the directory that you want to open. That's cool, but one thing that I find especially useful is using this command when opening up config files in an existing project. For example, I might want to edit a global config file like the bash profile. Instead of opening up a new window, I can just type in code with the path to that file and open it up here directly in this workspace. That's a lot easier than opening a new window or using something like Vim if you're not familiar with it. The bottom line is use the code CLI to get to where you need to go faster. Now that you know the basics of VS Code, we're going to look at a bunch of quick but very powerful editing tricks designed to improve your productivity when writing code. This first trick is related to IntelliSense. You might find yourself in a file and have no idea where to start. You can always hit Control Spacebar to trigger IntelliSense. In this JavaScript file, it will give us a big list of global objects. I'm going to choose crypto and then tab over to its getRandomValues method. Then I'll move the cursor somewhere else, but the problem is that now I'm not sure exactly what arguments to pass into this function. This can be kind of annoying, and a really useful technique to know is to put your cursor inside of the parentheses, then hit Control-Shift-Space to bring up parameter hints. That'll show you which arguments can be passed into this function. The bottom line here is that you'll want to memorize Control Space and Control Shift Space to bring up IntelliSense when you need it. One of the most time-consuming things a developer will do without even noticing it is move around with the mouse trying to place the cursor in the proper location. Optimizing this process, only if it saves you 1 second, can be a huge productivity boost because it's something that you'll do so often as you write code. One easy way to improve your speed is to use the command palette followed by the @ symbol to search for the symbol in the code that you're looking for. That one's especially powerful on a large file. From there you can start editing right away, or if you need to highlight something, you can hold down Shift with the arrow keys to highlight the text. Using Shift with the arrow keys tends to be a little more precise than using the mouse, but it does take some getting used to. In many cases though, you'll want to highlight multiple adjacent lines to copy or delete a block of code. Control L will highlight the current line, then if you hit it again, it will highlight the next line, and so on. When I'm prototyping something, I'm constantly hitting the arrow keys with Control L to move stuff around quickly. It's also a good idea to use line numbers to your advantage. If you know the exact line of code you're trying to get to, like in an error message or something like that, you can use Control G to quickly navigate exactly to that line. What I'd recommend doing is opening a file that you're working on and see how much editing you can get done without actually touching your mouse. Once you're comfortable navigating to and selecting code, you'll find that the mouse becomes mostly unnecessary. In this code example, we have some text, DNA, that we want to replace with a different value. The slowest way to go about it would be to modify each line manually. One better option is to use Find and Replace, which you can bring up by hitting Control F. Type in the characters that you want to search, then follow that up with the value that you want to replace them with. That works pretty well, but there's actually an even better option. When your cursor is on a symbol, like a variable name, you can hit Control D to highlight it. But what it's actually doing is adding that selection to the next find match. What that means is that if you hit Control D again, it will find the next value that has that same text, then hit it again to do the same thing as many times as you need. Then after you have all your matches, you can type in the new value and it will modify it on every line, just like it did with multi-cursor editing. This is a technique that I would highly recommend practicing because it makes your life much easier when you decide to change a variable name or function in your code. Let's imagine we have a list of items and we need to hard code the same line of code for each individual item. The slow way to go about it would be to paste the text into each item individually. A faster option is multi-cursor editing. By holding down Alt and using the mouse to click the cursor in the places that you want to edit, you can edit multiple lines at the same time. You'll notice the cursor blinking in multiple places, and when we start typing, it will add the same text to all of those locations. This is really nice when you want to add the same value to multiple places in your code. One thing you'll often need to do is take a line of code and move it somewhere else. The natural way to handle this is to right-click and cut the line and then paste it somewhere else. That works fine, but a much faster approach is to simply hit Ctrl-X when your cursor is on that line. You don't even need to highlight the text itself. Now, if you're just moving the line somewhere nearby, an even faster approach is to use Alt followed by the up or down arrows. That will grab the line your cursor is currently on and move it one line at a time wherever it needs to go. And if you want to copy the same line over and over again, like if you're just pasting in a bunch of boilerplate code, you can use Alt Shift followed by the arrows, and it will copy that line of code as you move it. When editing a large file, it can be very annoying to look at blocks of code that you don't really care about. Fortunately, VS Code has a feature called folding to temporarily hide code that you don't want to look at. In this particular file, we have 3 different classes, and you'll notice that when we hover in between the line numbers and the code itself, little arrows pop up. When you click on one of these arrows, it will fold the code, allowing you to condense the body of the code down to one single line. Now, if you want to fold everything on a page, it's much faster to use the command palette than find the fold and unfold commands. I usually fold everything, then selectively unfold what I actually need to work on. It can also be useful to fold up your code as you're working on it using the shortcut Ctrl-Shift bracket. An opening bracket will fold it, while a closing bracket will unfold it. And that gives you an easy way to hide code that you don't want to look at. In the last video, we learned about multi-cursor editing, and one way you might use it is to rename opening and closing HTML tags at the same time. This works okay, but there's actually a better way to go about it. If we hit Control-, to go back to our VS Code settings, there's an option for linked editing. When enabled, it will look for related symbols like opening and closing HTML tags, and when you rename one of them, it will rename the matching one automatically. If you're using HTML in web development or working with XML, I would highly recommend enabling this option. VS Code ships with a tool called Emmet, which provides a highly condensed syntax for quickly writing boilerplate code. It's mostly relevant to web developers writing HTML and CSS. Before you start using it, I would highly recommend grabbing the cheat sheet from the official documentation. To use it, go into an HTML file and start typing the name of an HTML element, like article. It should show a wrench icon and say Emmet abbreviation. If you hit Tab, it will automatically generate that element, but it also has syntax for generating more complex layouts. To add a child to an element, we can use an angle bracket, and that will nest the header inside of the article. Now, if we want to add additional siblings alongside the header, we can use the plus sign to add additional elements. And when we're all finished, hit Tab, and it generates all of those elements automatically. So as you can see, using a few basic Emmet abbreviations is very powerful. The single most common way that I use it personally is to create a list in HTML. Here I'm starting with an unordered list tag and giving it a child of list item. I can generate as many list items as I want by multiplying it by a number, and I can even add some lorem ipsum dummy text inside of each item. The bottom line is that Emmet gives you a way to write a lot of HTML quickly. If you work with a curly brace language like JavaScript, you'll likely end up with code with deeply nested functions where you have brackets and parentheses all over the place. Code like this can be very difficult to read because it's very difficult to tell which braces and parentheses are matched together. There's a setting in VS Code that will colorize the brackets, making it much easier to distinguish which ones are matched together. Open up the settings using the shortcut Control-, and search for Colorizer. You should see the option to enable bracket pair colorization, and that'll make your life much easier as a curly brace language developer. One thing I want to point out though is that there's an extension called Bracket Pair Colorizer. You can use this extension, however the built-in colorizer is much faster, especially on larger files. The VS Code team built this feature based on the original extension, but they were able to achieve much better performance, so I'd recommend using the built-in support over the extension. One thing you'll do every day as a developer is create new files and directories. Now, creating a new file is pretty self-explanatory, but here's one little trick I want to show you. In many cases, you'll want to create a new file that's in a nested subdirectory. Instead of creating the directory manually, you can just click the new file icon and then type out the entire file path with a slash, and VS Code will automatically create the directory for you. Another thing that's worth noting here is that when you create a file, VS Code keeps its own undo history in the File Explorer. That means if you create or delete a file, you can quickly restore it by hitting Ctrl-Z. That's the shortcut for undo, or if that undo was a mistake, use Ctrl-Shift-Z to redo. Undo and redo are keyboard shortcuts that you'll definitely want to memorize if you haven't done so already. Many of the commands that you can run from the command palette have a default keyboard shortcut, which is always going to be the fastest way to get things done. But again, it's impossible to remember everything, so you should really only allocate enough memory to your brain to remember the commands that you use on a regular basis. Sometimes you'll run into a command that doesn't already have a default key binding, or maybe you don't like the existing one and want to change it. To do that, click on the cog icon and go to Keyboard Shortcuts. Here you'll find a list of all the commands and their key bindings, and to change them, simply click on the pencil icon and change it. It's also worth noting that there's an official VS Code cheat sheet that contains all the most common key bindings, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to print that out and put it on your wall when you're first getting started, at least until those shortcuts are burned into your skull. The very first thing I like to do when I open up VS Code is personalize it. In the bottom left corner, you'll find a cog. Go ahead and click on it, and you'll notice it gives you the option for a color theme, file icon theme, and product icon theme. Personally, I really dislike the default VS Code theme, so we'll go ahead and click on color theme and choose a different option. There's a few defaults installed, like a light mode, but you'll most likely want to go to the extension marketplace to add a new one from the community. There's tons of different themes to choose from, and a website called vscodethemes.com to compare them all side by side. My personal favorite theme is Atom 1 Dark, but that's not the only thing that we'll want to customize. We can also change the icons here that you see in the File Explorer. By default, they're pretty basic icons, but you could remove them altogether with a more minimal theme, or you can go to the extensions marketplace again and install something like VS Code icons for a more colorful version. You can also customize the icons here in the activity bar by selecting the product icon theme. Personally, I always just stick with the defaults for the product icons. The final way you might customize the appearance is by changing the font. There are actually fonts out there that have been designed specifically for writing code. One example is the open source Fira code. You can download its font files from GitHub, and then back in VS Code, click on the cog icon again, and go to the settings. This panel is really important because it allows you to configure pretty much any kind of setting in VS Code. When configuring settings, your changes can either be global to the user, or scoped to a specific workspace or project. Things like themes and fonts are usually scoped globally to the user, so we'll go ahead and stick with that. Near the top, you'll see the option to change the font family. Go ahead and replace the default with Fira code. When you do that, you'll notice that the font in your code has changed. That's cool, but Fira code is a special font that contains something called ligatures, which can take multiple characters and turn them into a single symbol. It's entirely a matter of opinion, but this might make your code more readable because it takes multiple characters and condenses them down into one more visually attractive character. To opt into ligatures, we'll need to go back to the settings panel and type in ligatures into the search bar. You'll notice that it directs us to a settings.json file. Whenever you change your settings, VS Code is updating a file called settings.json under the hood. You can modify this file yourself manually, which we'll do now by adding the setting for editor.fontligatures, giving it a value of true. And now if you go into a file and start writing some code, like an equal sign followed by an angle bracket, it should convert that into an arrow ligature. If you type out every single character when you write code, you're doing it wrong. Modern editors like VS Code try to write as much of your code for you as possible. It does that in many different ways, the most fundamental of which is IntelliSense, which is just a fancy way of saying autocomplete. As you can see here, I'm in a JavaScript file, and if I type in document, it's going to automatically detect that I'm referencing the global document object that's available in a browser. VS Code has really good support for JavaScript and web development out of the box, but the quality of IntelliSense will depend largely on the language and frameworks that you use. A framework like Flutter has really good IntelliSense, but in order to use it, you first need to install the Flutter and Dart extensions. To keep things simple, I'll be using JavaScript and TypeScript examples in this course. If we type document into a JavaScript file and then hover over it, you can see it as a variable with a type of document. The type definition is where VS Code magically figures out how to autocomplete what should come next. If you right-click and then go to Peek Type Definition, it will take you to the file where that definition exists. You'll never have to mess with this file, it's just nice to know where the IntelliSense actually comes from. If we type a period after document, IntelliSense will autocomplete all of the methods and properties that come after it. A property or value is indicated by a blue box, while a method or function is indicated by a purple box. As we start typing, it will refine the selections here. When you see the one you want to autocomplete, use the arrow keys to select it and then hit Tab to autocomplete it. That's much faster than typing out the actual characters. If you hover over the method, it should provide the documentation for it if available. One useful shortcut to use when working with IntelliSense is Control Space. That'll bring up IntelliSense wherever you are currently. If the cursor is on the method, it will then bring up the other available methods here on the document. And if we hit Control Space again, it will bring up more detailed documentation if available. The final thing I want to mention about IntelliSense is that it will only work if VS Code has a way to infer the type of an object. When working with a dynamic language like JavaScript or Python, VS Code will try to do this automatically. But if the code contains values that are dynamic, it may be impossible to provide any useful IntelliSense. Developers using strongly typed languages like TypeScript or Dart generally get much better control over IntelliSense because those languages require explicit types, which then can be used by VS Code to generate IntelliSense. At its core, VS Code is just a program for editing files. So naturally, let's start by taking a look at the File Explorer. When you open up a folder with VS Code, it will give you a list of all the files and subdirectories in that folder. You'll often want to open and close this panel, which you can do by dragging with the mouse, but a much quicker approach is to use the Control Bravo shortcut. Throughout this course, I'm going to recommend shortcuts. If I recommend it, it's a very good idea to memorize it. It might seem like a trivial productivity gain, but when you combine a lot of these small things together, it can dramatically improve your productivity. When you click on a file in the Explorer, it opens it, and you can close it by clicking on the X, but another shortcut you should remember is Control Whiskey. That's a slightly quicker way to close a file. If you make changes to a file, you can see it adds a white dot up here to the tab, and you can save it by going to File Save, or better yet, use the Control Sierra shortcut. Now if we use the mouse to hover over the top of the Explorer, it gives us icons to create a new file, directory, and one really underrated one is to collapse all of the open folders in the Explorer. On larger projects, you might have multiple open directories and it gets really chaotic. Click the collapse button to close all of them without doing it one by one. The final thing I want to talk about when it comes to the Explorer is hidden files. You'll notice that it shows hidden files by default, which is any file that starts with a period, but that's not necessarily all of the files that exist here. If we go into the settings panel again and search for exclude, you'll notice that it excludes certain files based on patterns listed here. Ones you might recognize are Git or DSStore if you're on a Mac. You rarely need to see these files in your editor, but if you want to view them, you can simply remove them from exclude. Or if there's something you don't want to see, you can add it here. When it comes to leveling up your productivity, the command palette is probably the single most important thing to know. At the top here, you can see we have windows like File, Edit, Selection that open up windows just like any other piece of software. But when you're writing code with your keyboard, it can be very distracting to look around these menus to figure out which actual command you want to run. The secret to coding quickly is to get into a rhythm that avoids distractions like searching through a menu to find the right option to click on. Let's go ahead and close the File Explorer, then hit Control P to bring up the command palette. By default, it will give us a list of files in the project, with the most recent ones being ranked higher. You can type into this field to do a fuzzy search for other files in the project, and that's way quicker than trying to click through the directory structure of a large project. Now, after you've opened a file, you can bring it up again, and this time type the @ symbol into it. This will give you a breakdown of all of the code symbols in the current file. Not only does it give you a concise breakdown of what is in this file, but it also makes it much easier to navigate to the line of code that you're actually looking for. And that's much quicker than scrolling around by dragging the scroll bar up and down. But the most powerful feature is when you type an angle bracket into the command palette, or use Control-Shift-Papa to open it up with the angle bracket automatically. You can now quickly run any command in the entire editor. VS Code does a ton of stuff, and it's impossible to remember a keyboard shortcut for everything. The command palette bridges the gap by allowing you to search for commands that exist within the editor. For example, if you forgot how to open up the File Explorer, just type in File Explorer and you'll see the option to toggle it. Or maybe you want to open up the settings, which you can also quickly do from the command palette. It'll become even more useful throughout the course when we do more advanced things like set up tasks and install third-party extensions, because extensions can also expand the capabilities of VS Code. For example, here I have a JavaScript file, and I can execute that JavaScript in the file using an extension called Quokka, and now I get the output of my console logs directly in the editor. The bottom line here is that if you're ever not sure how to do something in VS Code, just hit Ctrl-Shift-Papa, then type out what you're looking for in the command palette to locate it quickly.